Shape tween animations. Okay, so I'm just going to fly through this again. But down here in my layer 1, I'm just going to name it shape. Again, on frame 1 here, again, I'm just going to select an oval shape. I'm going to draw it out. First, I'm going to pick a color up here in my swatches area. Just make it red. And then I'm just going to click and drag, draw that shape out. Take my selection tool here, and double click this shape and just kind of drag it over somewhere, okay, and just leave it at that. And down in my timeline then, I'm going to frame 25 and then holding control and then clicking. And that's going to bring up this menu here where I can just insert a keyframe. That gives me an exact duplicate of what I had on frame 1, just brings it over to frame 25. So now I'm defining the end of my animation here. And so I'm just going to bring it over this way. Alright, at this point I'm just going to kind of draw another shape, and I'm going to, on 25 here, I'm going to just draw it over this piece so it's going to kind of morph. So when I get my selection tool, I can actually just double click on both these shapes, and now these are one, these are pretty much intersected, right? And then very simply, it's just clicking on my timeline down here between these two keyframes, and then making sure that that's selected in between, and then I'm control clicking it and then hitting create shape tween. And then that, I'll just hit enter to preview what that looks like. That's essentially what it's going to look like. Again, we really have no control over the steps between the beginning and the end. It just kind of estimates what we want it to look like and just gives us a sample like that. So that's shape tween animation in a nutshell there. I'm just going to turn this off. Actually, just to save, I'm just going to delete this artwork altogether. Next is the classic tween we went over last time. I'm going to quick run over that again. This time I'm going to just use a rectangle shape. If you remember last time, you could import any kind of photo or something like that, and just do all of the same motion animations that you would even any of these shapes. The only piece is when you start this classic tween animation, I'll rename this shape, is you double click your object to make sure that's selected, and then you control click the object on the stage, and then we'll go down to convert to symbol. And then if you remember, you have it as a movie clip symbol, so you'll just keep it as movie clip, and then you can hit OK. Up here it's going to be, it says instance name. It's going to be important when we start doing creating buttons out of these individual objects. So I'm just going to call it shape for now, but this is a good habit to get into, is naming your objects that you create a symbol out of up here in the properties palette as soon as you do that. So, and then again, just like the shape tween, I'll go to frame 25 and then control click on the timeline, insert keyframe. Okay, so that's going to make a duplicate again of this purple box here. I'll just drag this purple box over to one side, and then under my properties palette with frame 25 still selected here in the timeline and my object on the stage, under my properties here, under color effect and style, I can go to tint, which is a real quick fix, and I can kind of adjust the color, right? So this is going to both move the object across the screen once I do a classic tween to this, and then it's going to change the color to what I'm thinking is going to be nice. All right, so here's my last frame, and then here's my first frame, and then everything in the middle to fill in those gaps. I'm going to click the timeline again, hold Control and click, and then I'm going to create the classic tween this time. And then hitting Enter will just preview that. So we got a motion, plus we have a kind of a color change, right? Next little piece we want to say is, okay, maybe I want this to, at the beginning of the frame, it'll be 100% opaque. at the end of the frame, it'll be, at the end of the animation rather, it'll be 0% opaque. So I'll just click the object at my frame 25, and then under Style, I'll select Alpha, which is another word for, essentially it's another name for transparency. They just call it that in Animate. So I'm just going to bring that down to 0, okay? So my tween is already created here in the timeline, so this is automatically going to adjust based on what I defined at the end here. So basically, I don't have to, do that control click in the timeline and go to create classic tween. It's just already created, and now it's just applying the properties that I'm adding to it over here. So I'm going to go back to tint, and then I'm going to, instead of this just moving kind of straight across like it is, I'm going to just rotate it then. So again, my end frame, I'm just going to make those changes that I see fit in the animation, right? So I'm going to go to Modify, Transform, while I have this object selected, and I'm just going to choose Free Transform and just kind of drag this around like that. And then I can just hit Enter and then preview it. So it's filling in the gaps of what the end of the animation would be based on where I have it in the positioning of everything. So that brings me to motion paths. So if I want to make this a little more dynamic, so I have my animation just kind of locked in here. If I want to make this more dynamic, down here under Shape, on this very left side, I'm going to control click this kind of blank area, and then I'm going to hit this Add Classic Motion Guide option. So I'm going to hit that button, and now it's going to, you can see in the bottom here, it adds this guide shape layer, and then it indents this shape layer underneath the guide shape layer. So it's just saying that this guide layer is applying a guide layer to the shape layer beneath it. So they're kind of tied together now. So on frame 1 then, on the guide shape layer, you can just kind of take your pen tool, make it a color that's really visible. It really doesn't matter because we can make this color invisible later. But what I'm going to do is just kind of draw a path with my pen tool and see how the shape just kind of attached to it automatically. So I'm just going to draw like this shape, and then on frame 1 I have my shape on the stage. What I'm going to do is get my selection tool and just make sure that this box is attached. See, that little center point is what we need to make sure that is locked in on the tip of that at one end of the line. In the last point, I have to actually do the same thing. So on my last frame, I have to bring this box over to make sure that that's locked in too. And it kind of snaps. But essentially, that's when you test it, that's how you know it's working. It's moving really fast, so if you remember how to slow things down, you need to add more frames. So I can actually click on both of these frame 25 layers here, and then I'll just kind of drag it out to like 50. So I'm actually gonna make it slower now because it's got more frames to kind of render. And the only last piece is to get rid of this this crazy line. So just hit this little dot underneath the eyeball here in the timeline, and then that just gets rid of it. Should you want to make any edits to it, you can just open it up, get your direct selection tool, click on the line, and then just like you would in Illustrator, you can kind of tweak this path a little bit, and then just kind of see what happens. Oh, it didn't really work that well. Hold on a second. Well, I think at that point you'd have to just redraw it, which would be fine. You would just delete this guide shape layer and just redraw the way you would want to. The reason why is because when I unlock this, it creates a it created a keyframe at the end. So if I had to make any changes, I'd have to make them twice equally, which is really hard to manage. So I would just delete and kind of rebuild it again. So that is the clipping path animation. I'm going to actually delete this again. I'm going to import just an image. This is going to go through masking, so I'm going to import to the library. I'm going to start importing to the library a little bit more just because there's some important points to go over for that. I'm going to import just the green shoes here. So again, it reads all the PSD layers, and you can just select which layer out of the bunch you want to import. And then so I open up my library tab, and I have my shoe layer. And then I'm just dragging this out onto to the stage. With it selected on the stage, I'm clicking on my properties palette, and for the reason of resizing, so I'm just dragging, this width down to resize it. I'm going to try and keep it larger so we can see the mask a little bit easier. And quickly rename this layer. So again, just how you would do, just how you would grab the clipping mask, the clipping path option. It's again, you control click this this name here in the timeline, and then you would hit mask. Oh, actually no, you have to actually click create a new layer. And then so I have to create a new layer and actually name this mask above my shoes layer. Now I would click mask. So once I clicked mask on this mask layer that I just made, it just added a new layer. It creates a mask layer for you, and so what you would then do is draw your shape on the mask layer, and it would mask. It would create a mask over your shoe as you animated it. So on the shoes layer, I'm going to go to frame 25, and I'm just going to control click that frame here, and I'm going to insert the keyframe. Oops. And then then it's just a matter of creating an animation over this. So on frame 1 for the mask layer, then I'm just going to create this rectangle here. And then I'm double clicking it, so I'm going to convert this to a symbol. So convert to symbol. It's a movie clip symbol. Okay. Now I'm going to let's see, what's the next piece? I'm going to go to modify and transform and free transform while I have this selected. And then I'm going to take this little center point, because this is the anchor point that my animation, or when I extend this thing onto frame 25, this is going to be the point at which it's locked down as I extend the box. So I'm dragging this little white point over, essentially, once I transformed it. Now I'm going to frame 25 here on my mask layer and control clicking, and then inserting a keyframe. So again, I got that duplicate out, and then now I'm going to extend this shape over my shoe completely. And then now on my mask layer, I'll just control click it, and then I'll do a classic tween for that. So now I have a mask layer with an object that is kind of growing via this tween here. Now, so what you do is actually I'm going to lock this shoe layer down so I don't mess with it, and I'm going to lock the mask layer down. Because the way it works, for some reason, in this program is that both layers have to be locked if you want to preview the mask on the stage. So if you weren't happy with that object, you could then unlock both of these layers to then reveal the mask layer above, and then you can kind of edit that. So otherwise, you could just delete the mask layer and then do another mask layer over it. So I'll just do another one really quick. I deleted it, mask, and then I'll do like a circle this time instead of just a large rectangle. So control click, mask, and then just start building. This time it'll be just this circle that goes over it from one point to the other. Create, convert to a symbol, hit OK. This is going to allow me to create a classic tween. So insert a keyframe on 25 or whatever frame you want. Drag it somewhere else so it actually has some kind of an animation. I'm going to modify it this time by just doing a free transform to it so it kind of is a little more dynamic. Back to the mask layer, create classic tween, lock it down, and then that's just a simple mask animation. All right. Okay, so again, I'm just going to erase all of these, and we're going to set to we're going to show you what the buttons are all about. So I'm just going to call this layer now this time button, and I'm going to use text because this is going to be a little bit easier to see how this works, and I'm going to use a really thin typeface. And the reason is because I want to demonstrate some of the button properties with this thin typeface. So I'm just going to use the words button very simply. I'll make this pretty large. So in my properties palette again, I can just drag the size option, hit my selection tool, and now I can kind of move this guy. Same with type, you have to convert this to a symbol to create a button. So a button really is a symbol. So I'm going to click this object on the stage here, and then control click it once it's selected. And then I'm going to select convert to symbol here on the pop-up. And then under this type option, this is the type of symbol I'm converting to. Instead of movie clip this time, that we've like we've been using this whole time, I'm just going to call it button. I'm just going to hit OK at that point. Same idea when we create movie clip symbols. It's a good practice to just rename it here in the properties palette because, again, when we apply action script, especially to buttons, we're going to need them to have some kind of an action. So I'm just going to name it, provide a name for that piece. All right, so now I have this type here set as a button. There's a couple different things you can do with this. The first thing I would do with a button like this is I would double click the object. Now if you remember that, that breadcrumb path that we were talking about last time, we start from scene 1, so I'll jump out of it. This is scene 1. This is the highest level you can get within the interface and the objects. But if you double click a symbol object, i.e. a button symbol or a movie clip symbol like that, you're going to go one level deeper into this object. And if you notice, this timeline changed. So this timeline changes differently for a movie clip symbol or for a button symbol. In this case, we're in a button symbol, so this timeline is now rendering the button properties in the timeline. So you can see where we're at. We're under symbol 4 in scene 1. So this is the breadcrumb path that we're at currently. So what does this kind of do down here? We have a couple different properties. There's one that's called up, one that's called over, one that's called down, and one that's called hit. So these look a lot like frames in your timeline, but they're just named actually differently. So what up means is that that's how the button looks when it's not being hovered over with your mouse. Over is the property where your mouse is hovering over it. Down is the property where you have clicked on the button, and that kind of changes the look. So on the web you would see like a click on a regular old blue link and it would turn purple. And down, or I'm sorry, and then hit state is a different property that I want to show you. It actually defines where the area of the clickability of the button is. Okay, so it's easier to show than to say, but we'll start. We'll set an over state for this button. So control click the over area here, and then insert keyframe. It's just making a duplicate. At this point, I can just double click this text here. Let's say my over state is bold. So my button turns bold when I go over it. Okay. My down state, I can define that too. What I'm going to do is control click the down frame, and I'm going to insert a keyframe there too. It's going to be bold, and maybe it changes color. So I'll just change the color. Too yellow. All right. So that's fine. Now I'm going to jump out of it because my temporary work here is done. And then I'm going to test this out. So I'm going to go over to Control and then Test. Now here is a sample of your file. It's an SWF file. So you can see the file name here as SWF. This is the final file type that would be exported essentially from Flash. That would be, from Animate, that would be provided to an advertising vendor that you would host your ad on. So this is basically like a real-time preview of what you would see at the end of the whole in final mock-up. So we have our button. You can see that the mouse actually creates that little finger point, if you will, over it. So it is a clickable button, and you see that hover state happening. And then that click state too, or that down state, I'm clicking and it's turning blue. Okay, so that's where it's borrowing all of these properties from. If I want to make a change to it, it's easy. In Animate here, I'm just going to double click, and then I'll go back and change my different states. Right, so I'm going to make this light. I'm going to make this light as well. Jump to scene 1, test. So these are all the states that I have in this button. So what if I wanted to, let me test this again and show you really quick. So what if I wanted this outer range of this button to be clickable, like not just the text as I get close to here, but actually way out here, like if I wanted this entire screen to kind of be clickable as a button, you would do that in the button state 2, which is called hit. So under the hit state, you would just do a control click. You can insert a blank keyframe, and then you could just draw a shape, and it's not going to show up. At least it shouldn't show up. And then so that should be the clickable hit area. So now like on every edge of this canvas, it's clickable. Now this helps if you have just little tiny pieces of text that need to have a little more area to be clicked on. All right, just gonna delete that now. And very quickly, I'm going to show this time a movie clip symbol that has an animation within it. So it's very similar to how we would produce a button symbol. We double clicked inside of that button symbol and we went into that inner state, if you will, of the button and tweaked its properties within it. So this is going to be very similar. Basically, I'm just going to draw a shape here on the timeline. I'm going to call this layer square. So I'm going to just draw one instance of it here. And then I'm going to control click that object and then convert it to a symbol. This symbol, instead of button, then where it defaulted, I'm going to hit movie clip and then just hit OK. So now I have this movie clip symbol, which is great. It's called square, right? So I'm going to actually double click inside of it, and if you look at the breadcrumbs at the top left, now you can see that I'm in scene 1, now I'm in symbol 5. But you can see the properties of this object have that little checkerboard pattern to it as well. That means I have to actually create another symbol out of it so I can animate it within this area. So I'll show you kind of what that means. Again, we're just going to go convert to symbol once again. Hit OK. So now in my timeline I have an animation within an animation. Remember, this was called shape or square when we were back at one level up. So I can actually rename this like purple now. So it's purple within the square. Actually, I want to make it, call it purple to pink, because that's what I want the color change to be. So on frame 1 on this object, I'm going to have it be this purple state, but now on frame, like let's say like 25, I'm going to control click and insert a keyframe here. The first thing I want to do with this object now at frame 25 is I want it to end up looking kind of pink, so I'm going to go over to my color effect part here, and I'm going to give it, let's see, make it look pink really. Another thing I want it to do is to actually spin and like get a lot of attention and be really obnoxious. So I'm going to actually go modify, transform, and free transform, and then I'm just going to do that basic kind of spin move. Again, I'm going to then create the classic tween by control clicking here in my timeline and just testing it out. So that's what it looks like there. Alright. Now what I want to do is actually make it go back to the purple, right? Because I want it to have a constant rotation. Within this timeline, it actually, when you render this thing without telling it to stop, it just keeps going. It keeps going on and on forever. So that's what's going to happen. I'm going to go back to frame 1 and I'm going to copy this shape on the same layer. Now I'm going to go to frame 40, control click, insert keyframe. That makes a duplicate of that pink piece, so I'm going to delete that. Now I'm left with a, actually no. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to leave that blank for now, and I'm going to go to edit and paste in place. That's going to paste my purple piece that came from frame 1. Now I'm going to do another tween by control clicking and creating a classic tween here, and then that should kind of bring it back. So it's going to spin a little bit and then it's going to spin back to where it was. That's my animation that I want for this symbol. So I'm going to jump out of it and go back to scene 1 by just clicking. You can either click the arrow or you can click scene 1. But you can see that I still have square on one frame of this animation, right? So let me test it. So up in control test, it's going to export a SWF file, and you can see that my animation within my single frame called square here is rendering motion that's about 45 frames long, but that's inside of the one object here that I'm calling square. So how could this help you in the future? Maybe you have a background that has motion in it that you want to move separate from other elements of your composition. This is how you would pull it off. Your background would be just one giant movie clip symbol with an animation within it on one frame of your piece. So at this point, what I want to do is actually animate this movie clip symbol. So instead of animating the rotation, but also the movement in one piece, I know I want the same movement across the board, across multiple pieces. So what I'm going to do is, let's see, what I'm going to do is actually jump in here, and in my animation or in my symbol, I'm going to create a new layer. And I'm going to name this layer A. And then the artwork for layer A is going to be some type. So I'm going to select this type and I'm going to make it white. I'm going to just drag it over. It's just going to be the letter A. So I'll kind of center this in. Drag my playhead. There's my symbol. So I'm happy with it. Again, I'll jump out of it again and I'll do another test. So every little move I do, I'll do a test just to make sure it's what I want. Okay, good. So I'll close that out. Now I'm basically going to take this object and I'm going to animate this independently. So I'm dragging this off of the pasteboard and then I'm going to create a new keyframe here. I'm going to insert a keyframe on frame 25. And then this is going to kind of show up at this frame to about this point, right? And then clicking back, I'm just going to then create a classic tween, and then this will be my basic animation. So I'm actually previewing this in Animate right now. I have not exported an SWF file. That's why you're seeing just a box move across the screen right now. Now let me just qualify that by testing it, see? So it's moving from one point to the other and kind of has its spin property, but it's not previewing that here, which is fine because it tells you, it says, you know, you got to preview it when you double click your movie clip symbol. Okay, fine. I want a couple other elements that are very similar to this but a little bit different. Can I copy and paste it? Well, the answer to that is no. Unfortunately, you can't. So what I'm going to have to do is go into my library and make that happen. So I'm going to create a new layer and I want to have this square have the letter B in it, right? So I'm going to jump into my library here and I'm going to look through all of my symbols and I'm going to see that I have this symbol 5. Symbol 5. So symbol 5, if I rename it, I'll just call it symbol A, just to make it easier to find. But if I drag this out and I double click inside of it, this is a copy of my symbol that I created originally. I can't do that because if I make any changes to it, it's going to change every instance of A. So what I need to do in my library is actually create a copy of it. So I need to control click that and then I need to hit duplicate, and now it's actually going to duplicate this symbol for me and I'm just going to rename it B. Now I drag symbol B out onto my workspace here. It looks like something happened with my... Oh, I know what's happening. I actually have to drag B out. So I drag, let me go back here. Yeah, so I drag B out onto the stage, and then I'm going to actually then edit the animation to change the name of my layers and then the actual letters of that symbol. And so now I have B out there on its own separate layer. I'm going to lock up A just so it doesn't get really difficult to manage. And then on frame 1, then I'm going to just drag B out at the same position as A. I want them to kind of come in at the same time or maybe stagger. So I'm just treating B like an element now. I'm going to frame 25 on the layer, and then I'm gonna hit Control. I'm just gonna Control click it, and then excuse me, insert keyframe, and then I'm just gonna drag it to where I want it to end, and then create a classic tween out of that. So just to test, they're moving at the same time. It's fine. Now again, I'm going to do another copy of B here in my library by just control clicking and hitting duplicate, and then I'm going to call it C. And for C, I do need to create a new layer, call it square C on layer 1, and drag it out. Jump into this, change my type, change my layer name, excuse me, and then go back to scene 1, drag it out here, and then just make my animation like I normally would. Control click keyframe, bring this up like that. And then finally, of course, creating the classic tween. So these are both moving simultaneously. Different objects. So at this point, I'm just going to then stagger them, right? So for C, I'm going to have this move in later. So I'm just going to bring this over. I'm just shift clicking these frames. So I'm holding shift, clicking the first one, and clicking the last one with shift held down. And I'm just off-centering these. And then finally, as you see, these different layers are staggered, right? I have square A at the very bottom, and looking at my timeline, you can see where my artwork is. I'm dragging this playhead over where A kind of starts to come and then stop, but now on frame 26, it disappears because actually the artwork here is falling off. Easy way to fix that is to just go all the way to the last frame of your animation, control click, and hit insert frame. So it's basically just going to copy the artwork so it stays visible throughout the animation as long as you want. And then the same with square B layer. I'm just going to insert that too. So now everything is on screen visible the whole time. Alright, so final steps here. Under control, I'm going to test it. Again, so we have our different shapes coming in, but now they're just disappearing, right? So what Animate does is basically it will repeat the entire animation over and over again to infinity. So that's why we have our spin happening basically to infinity forever. So what we will end up needing to do is putting a stop action at the end of this little video piece here to make this video actually stop. So very simply, you're just going to click on any of the last frames that you want this thing to appear or to stop on, and then you're going to go to Window, and then under Actions, again that's Window Actions, this giant menu is going to pop up. The only thing that you really need to be concerned with besides the code that shows up in this menu eventually, but today, is really this code snippets button here right next to the question mark. Now once you click on that, you're going to get another menu. Okay, so this menu is called the code snippets menu. And under action script, there's a little folder here. It's called action script. When you drop that down, you're going to see a bunch of folders, and what they have basically contained within them is a bunch of code options that you can essentially double click and implement some code, implement action script onto your piece that way. Under timeline navigation, this is where your stop action is located, and it very simply just says stop at this frame. So if you just double click that, it's going to push some code right into here, And this code is going to have all this grayed out stuff, and it's going to have this pretty much solid text here. This is actually just all the ActionScript code that there is. All this other stuff is just instructions, what this thing does. You know, the flash timeline will stop pause at the frame where you insert this code. Okay, great. I had my playhead over here. I just double-clicked, basically stopped at this frame, and inserted down here below a little letter A on a layer that it created for me automatically that's called Actions. I did not have to create that layer whatsoever. I just made sure my playhead was at the place that I wanted it to stop. I opened up my code snippets just as you saw, and I just double-clicked it, and then now I can just close it out. So this is how I know in my timeline that I have a piece of ActionScript code that's controlling it. And then finally, I would just control and test the movie, and then confirm that the objects did actually stop at that frame. So they're not, again, it's not cycling and things are coming in and leaving and things are, you know, over and over again. This is actually stopped at this frame number 49, and that's that. So that the stop frame, I'm sorry, the stop action is what we just demonstrated there.